Well, in this session, we're going to look at the key elements of effective assessment, and we're going to look at performance assessment techniques and how you could use portfolio assessments in almost any class from kindergarten to graduate school. We're going to look at rubric construction, what some of the key characteristics are in constructing performance evaluation tools, and then finally a brief look at descriptive and inferential statistics and the difference between norm reference and criteria reference testing, and then how we can tell if a test is reliable or valid. So I hope you enjoy this session. Well, what are the key elements of a good assessment system in a classroom? Love this little cartoon. I hope at the end of this current teaching practices, I'm not the college professor that you line up and say the exam questions weren't covered in the class, but what are keys to good assessment systems? Well, typically the old paradigm looked at teaching and then testing and then giving a grade in a summative way and then going on. It was the one-room school where kids sat in rows. That was the old factory model type of school, and so kids were simply sorted by how they did the first time around on whatever performance or paper and pencil test was given them at the end of the instruction. But as we look at the shift in thinking, we're seeing now assessment is not a standalone type of endeavor that teachers do to sort kids. It's more of a formative process that you set your goals, then you test, you teach, you test, and retest, then you collect multiple types of assessments as evidence of progress, and you develop learning profiles from these assessments, and then provide in informative ways feedback as kids progress through the learning of the key objectives, and then you reflect using what you found in the assessment. So we have all people involved, students, and even, as you see later, parents involved in the use of assessments in setting goals and reaching those goals. Any assessment system tries to answer one basic question: have students actually learned what you intended them to learn? And it takes time to set up those types of assessments, just like you saw in the video. The formative assessments that you use over the weeks as the unit passes or the semester passes build to a more of a summative assessment at the end of certain time periods. But in good testing and in good assessment, there are no surprises. You know exactly as a student what that teacher demands and what he's going to ask you to do at the end. And so when kids know this, when they know exactly what's expected of them, well, the vast majority of them will live up to those expectations and hit that target that you've set for them. For an assessment really to be valid or to be effective, it should be three things. That is, valid, systematic, and practical. That is, the more that you test the objectives, the more you center in and focus on and telling kids what they exactly need to do, the more valid that assessment system is going to be. The more systematic you make it, that is, you have and can track a series of formative assessments that build towards that summative, so kids know in a frequent series of assessments exactly how they're doing, what they need to do to correct, and what they need to do to go on and even to enrich. So it is a systematic, one thing after another, and then it's practical. It's related to, as much as possible, the real world. And so I would love to say that, for example, in teaching, that each of you are going to be great teachers simply because you took this class, you watched this video, and you did well on the questions and the final test. But in all practicality, where you're going to learn to teach will be actually the performance in the classroom. Trial and error of doing those things that we talked about in this class, applying them to what fits your practical situation. So assessments try as much as possible to mirror the real world, to be practical. Well, the keys also to effective assessment revolve around what you do as a teacher. That is, preparing kids for what you know are the final assessments, or the summative assessments, especially for state tests and any of the diagnostic tests that you give. But getting them ready, not a week before the assessment, but in a scope and sequence of curriculum that teaches the major objectives early, to where kids are exposed to it well ahead of time. Then they practice it well ahead of time and master it well ahead of time. So by the time the assessment comes around, it is old material for them. It is a material that they can have practiced and can easily recall. And then giving the assessment, as you found in the state testing programs, many of them now have a long series of instructions that you got to read and sometimes even go to training for. But it boils down to a rather simple concepts. You give kids directions of exactly what you want happening over a certain time period. And you administer that assessment in a kind of a atmosphere that's not going to have outside noises and activities impinging upon their concentration. And then teachers examine the results. It does no good to give an assessment and then not to use the results and give the kids the results and parents so that they can know exactly what they need to do to hit that target later on. So let's talk about some of these keys to good assessment. Well, student evaluation should always reflect the extent of to which the student has mastered the objective. You remember having teachers grade on a curve, still kind of popular in higher ed, but it exactly kind of does very little good because it kind of shies away from exactly what the kids need to do to be successful at certain measures. A good balanced multidimensional assessment system has performances, and it has what we call structured responses, those things that are paper and pencil that can be true and false, multiple choice, essay, but they are constructed responses that measure what they know. That is the lower level of Bloom's taxonomy. And then it also has the upper level of those things where they can apply, where they can actually learn by doing. So from a balance perspective, using both of those, I think you cover all of that spectrum of moving from lower level to higher level performances and thinking and believing. So typically in looking at the types of things available to public school teachers, you have a wide umbrella of ways to collect information, from performances to actual finished products, to portfolios where you collect those finished products and performances. You can even use, as we see, personal communications and actually observational anecdotal records. So all of these types of things could be used to develop a summative evaluation that would be much more fair than using one test on a Friday afternoon filling in ovals. Sharing those results with parents and the students, and doing it through progress reports and conferences and even portfolios are great vehicles to allow them to be used in a teaching situation. If we look at the lower level types of ways that we test kids, we look at written tests, and you have true and false questions typically on those, and those measure the lower level content knowledge. typically asking for thinking between two logical responses, and it's good for clearing up misconceptions. It helps to simplify large amounts of context, and you can quickly answer those. It doesn't take long. They're easy and quick. But again, the negative is that there's a 50-50 chance, and so guessing could be a possibility, and that leads to some low reliability on those tests. Typically, we use true and false for those ideas that maybe could be complex that you could synthesize to one idea. It's never good to try to trick the student by using double negatives or words like never or only or all. And it's really kind of unfair sometimes to just focus on the trivial detail, the trees, I guess, if you have a large amount of detail in the test that the kids would need to remember. When you look at the multiple choice, excellent way to complete right answers with incomplete statements. You can give kids multiple choices, and then they have to differentiate. And this leads to some upper level thinking skills of application, synthesis, analysis, and evaluation tools. So it leads to some better reliability, and it reduces guessing. It can cover large amounts of material because it offers multiple answers. It requires very little writing, so it's sometimes a little quicker to answer. And they're hard to create. The multiple choice or sometimes need some creativity to come up with plausible incorrect answers. So typically we find in a good multiple choice question it has 4 alternatives in a logical order a lot of times. Again, you don't want to try to trick them with double negatives or some tricky wording. And typically avoid that all of the above and none of the above. And you want to, throughout the test, place the correct answer at random throughout the multiple choice selections. Typically in matching, not one that we listed here, but matching is great for cause and effect. It forces students to match something with something else. Maybe a problem with a solution or terms with definition. And again, it's good for lower level content knowledge. And at times, if we do it right, for upper level comprehension. There's a lot of control over what is said, and it allows kids to refocus on the important parts. It can be time consuming, and it's hard to write, and you need to give clear directions and make the responses as short as possible to allow an easy, clear match with the term or the definition. If we look at essay, the essay or short answers let's look at the short answers. They're typically for upper level thinking skills, and they're simple to construct. They are could be emphasizing who, what, when, where in the material, but also ask you to combine some of those upper level thinking things for a one-word answer. Guessing is minimized here, but it emphasizes memorization of facts or names or dates. And if the question is poorly written, it sometimes leads to one or more correct answers that give you trouble on the key. If you look at essay, those are extended responsives, and you're free to allow sometimes some divergent or creative thinking. And so again, it's upper level with application, synthesis, and evaluation. You know, it's really good for getting kids to organize their knowledge or express opinions or show originality. Can stimulate future explorations. They can be rather hard to evaluate because they are subjective, so thus there's lower reliability, and it takes time to evaluate. So sometimes rather hard. But a good test has a variety of these types of questions, not just all true and false, just not all multiple choice and the like. When teaching and testing really are aligned, if you tell kids what they're going to do to the objective and you keep harping on that in summative testing, it's a lot like singing in the rain. You feel good. Kids, after they take a test, will feel like they've done well. So, always the key, test what you teach and teach what you test. We don't dance like that much anymore, do we? To look at performances, we typically ask kids to perform a skill or learn through doing different things. And so in performances, we typically grade those by rubrics. And here you could have kids conduct their own experiments. And many times, a great way is to have them produce a video or a documentary on a computer. And they're pretty good at using different types of cameras and videotaping machines. Fun for them also to learn technology skills, produce their own video. You could have them teach a concept to their classmates, and that's an excellent way to video and grade by rubric. Stage debates, role plays. One of the best ways anymore, even down on the third grade level, have kids make their own PowerPoint presentation of a selected topic. And so these presentations oftentimes, when they are formalized in the secondary school, especially maybe for graduation, is to present that learning to a panel of faculty and sometimes board members, community members, and students, which is evaluated. And when kids pass those, and they're allowed to graduate, and it shows to the community that these kids can do more than just pass tests. They can actually think on their feet and talk and do a myriad of things other than just graduate based on seat time. Performance is an excellent way to look at applying knowledge. Another way are through products of written reports, research reports, writing your journal entries every day as a sponge activity, having them do visual displays, whether that be paper, pencil, or PowerPoint. They could be to chart or graph, make a concept, or organize a graphic organizer. A lot of times producing a musical project, artistic project, for example, after studying Beowulf, do a comic strip or sing the ballad of Beowulf to show that you learn the key plot, rising action, and the like. So all of these products could show that in a real world, authentic way that kids have learned that material. All of these, it could be even the paper and pencil test, could all be collected as a representative work over time where kids at certain benchmarks reflect upon what they learned and then collect those and have them graded at the end by the teacher, or, and I love this concept in some elementary schools from kindergarten to 12th grade to 5th grade when they graduate. They start in elementary school, and each year that portfolio is passed along to the next teacher, and there are certain things that are put in each grade level to mark the benchmarks. And then at the end, you give it to the parents at the end of 5th grade. And think how powerful that would be to have a videotape of your child and certain things that he did in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. Start with his first writing sentence, which basically would be writing the letters, to where he could actually write a paragraph, to do his first presentation performance in kindergarten through 5th grade. I think it would be a tremendous thing for a parent to have and to keep the rest of their life, and to show that to a school that this is what you gave me as a parent. This is your child in 1st grade. Now in 5th grade, this is what we're giving you back. This is what he can do. vast difference in that. I always tell the story, and I love this story. When my son came back from sixth grade, first week in middle school, he said he's going to join the band. I said, how wonderful, because I love music but can't read music. And so I said, gosh, son, that's cool. Next week he came back and he said he's going to play the clarinet. And I said, we need to buy one. He said, we need to buy one. So we went down, we bought a clarinet, or rented one. And so we came back and we tried to put it together, and we didn't even know how to put it together. So that's where the baseline data starts. We didn't even know how to put the instrument together. Well, the next day he comes back, he said, Dad, here's how you put it together. Then we tried that night to make music from it and couldn't. So the next day he comes back and tells us, well, we need to read. So, we start at the very basics. And then I'm invited a couple of months to go to a class presentation. I'm almost embarrassed to go, because I would just wonder what's going to come out of my son's instrument. And so I go, and they play three 30-second little songs, and they actually sounded fairly good. Well, then I come back at Christmas, and there he is sitting on stage, and here he plays a good 4 or 5 songs, each a minute long. It sounds really good. And at the end of the year, we come back, and there he's even better. And so my respect for that music teacher was tremendous, because we started with the kid couldn't even put together an instrument, and now he can make music with it. Tremendous way to show. I wish we could do that in all of our different endeavors. Well, portfolios can collect that, and even in teaching, we ask at Pittsburgh State our teachers to collect over their 4 years a number of artifacts to put in their professional character portfolio that would illustrate their professional characteristics, their ability to plan, classroom management, and the like. And there's a myriad of artifacts that could go in there to show that they can do certain things. So artifacts for teachers are a tremendous way to better, almost sometimes in a test score, to show a superintendent that is considering hiring that individual. This is what we're getting, what level of performance that person has. And many of the professional fields do that, from graphic design, artist, advertising. All of these require that individuals submit portfolios for evaluation, even before the interviews. Another way of assessing individuals is through personal communication, of having team interviews. To graduate from one of our local high schools, they have to present in front of a panel their research project for their senior year. We don't have to maybe go to that great extent, but interviewing kids, if, for example, here at Pittsburgh State, to get your master's thesis approved, you go before a panel of individuals, and a lot of times graduate students are sitting in the background, and you defend your dissertation or defend your master's thesis. And team interviews, great way to collect data. And then simple conferences with teachers and administrators, and that are set up periodically to show, well, how are you doing? How are we meeting these objectives? Blah, blah, blah. So personal communication, sometimes not always considered in a total assessment system, but need to be given some significant looks. The observational records, that is narratives explaining how the kid went about obtaining the objective, of following checklists showing levels of obtainment, of scripting, what we saw happening, of collecting certain data on specific types of tests, and then even teaching by sticky notes. And that sounds kind of silly. Well, assessments take many different forms. It could be sticky notes that kids use, but also in any of the performances, one of the things that we found in the last decade that is really working well are rubrics that offer a criteria-based way to evaluate very specific levels of performance, and giving these to the kids before they have to complete the performance also tells them the target, exactly what is expected of them to complete, what are the criteria for judging their project. And there are usually three keys that many of the researchers will perhaps suggest when you construct rubrics. And now they're so easy because you can use a Ruby Star and other technology tools found easily on the internet that help you in just a matter of 5 minutes construct a very valid type of instrument. Well, typically researchers tell us to shy away from using words like excellent, good, and unclear in your criteria of judging, because they are simply not very well defined, and what is in one person's perception of excellent may be not the criteria found in another. So those don't do a whole lot of good. Each criteria that you list should be very specific, that describes the specific performance at that rating. That is, what are the key things that you want in a performance. And then for the rating scale, you typically define that performance as accurately as possible. And then 3, to shy away from using 3 or 5 point scales, because in those scales it simply is easier for the rater to, if he's uncertain, choose the middle. And with 4 and 6 point scales, it allows them to and forces them to come down on one side or the other to be more decisive. So tends to. So there are different ways to assess kids, and more comprehensive you make it, probably the better it is for kids. And to end, the driving force, and a somewhat controversial force that we're seeing in this, since No Child Left Behind, is that move towards standardized testing in all 50 states. At the time No Child Left Behind was implemented, we had no national curriculum or core standards other than maybe those fashioned by the national disciplines such as the Math Association and so forth, with their comprehensive curriculum standards. But this move has led to what we see now occurring in coming up with a core curriculum. And over the last 10 years, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers have been meeting, and they developed for state adoption national standards on language arts, which was thought of as reading, writing, language, and speaking and listening. And in that, literacy in the fields of history and social studies, science, and technological studies. And then, secondly, mathematics. Again, there are 2 types of tests that we can give kids, just to kind of wrap up some key terms that are sort of important in understanding national and state tests. A norm reference test is typically where all the scores are compared to norms, which means that you're going to compare the child to who else took that test. They're in percentile types of results. For example, if I score a 79, that would mean that there were 78 people that did worse than me, and then 20, some would do, they did better than me. It doesn't really tell us what they knew, what they didn't know, but how they compared with the kids that took that test. And then the criteria reference tests are more common. They're tests that compare the student's scores with very specific domains of behavior, and it tells the student what she or he does know or doesn't know. So they're criteria reference. They test what they teach. When we look at how you analyze these types of tests, there are 2 types of statistics. Descriptive statistics simply summarize the population data of the sample population. They're operations like figuring the mean, median, or mode, and of that standard deviation. They express themselves a lot of times in percentages or percentiles or stay nines or t-scores and z-scores, and the expectation is that there's a normal distribution of scores, and you can kind of project the mean, median, and mode of a norm population. The inferential statistics are those types of statistics that draw inferences about the sample population, about the mean, median, and mode, and the like. And they deal with finding correlations, relationships between different variables, regression analysis, analyzing what's happening in those indicators. We're dealing with estimation and hypothesis testing, and typically we don't see these unless you're doing research studies or doctoral or master's thesis. So descriptive statistics are usually what you're going to get when a test score comes to you. And typically, as you look at tests, you want to deal with and hopefully have high reliability, which is a term meaning the degree to which the test measures the degree at which the test measures the same each time it's given under the same conditions. It's reliable if the kid's score is the same test when it's given twice, if he has the same score. Validity is the degree to which the test measures what it says it's going to measure, what it claims to measure, and it's valid if there's a strong relationship between the test and the objective that was intended to measure. So validity and reliability are sort of important when you analyze, is this test going to be good for my kids? So testing and assessment all are a complex way of showing parents and students how they did on the material that was covered over a specific time. And I think one of the best ways to have reliability is to test what you teach and teach what you test. Don't be like some of my college professors that will add in a couple of questions he never taught just so he could have a standard distribution of grades. Because that's more of an idea that your primary purpose of a teacher is to sort. Secondly, I think one of the great maxims is don't make testing a guessing game. Test the objectives. You tell kids what they're going to learn, and then you teach to it and you assess to it. So there's no guessing game when it comes to test time. One of the keys that we found, if you want kids to do well, you break it up into small parts. And so the more frequent the assessment, the higher the achievement we typically find. And then plan, teach, and adjust. A very easy way to look at how assessment should fit into the management of your class. You plan it, then you teach it, and you assess it. And if you didn't do it well, you teach and reassess. And key to getting all kids to learn, because learning is a matter of time. And then lastly, the feeling that kids get from genuine achievement is the single most important motivation in human behavior. That is, if you make them struggle a little bit, if you make them work hard, that moment of, I got it, is a mighty powerful motivating effect. Good luck on your assessments.